Winter 1944. The war had already consumed millions of lives, turned cities into rubble, and frozen the hearts of men who once believed in mercy. But in a prisoner of war camp, deep in the forests of eastern Germany, something impossible was about to happen. Something that would haunt two men for the rest of their lives. This is the story of a moment so small it could fit in the palm of a hand, yet so powerful it would echo across decades. A story about bread, about hunger, and about the choice one starving man made that changed everything. His name was Thomas Archer, British soldier, 23 years old, captured during the retreat from Arnhem in September 1944, when Operation Market Garden collapsed into chaos and thousands of Allied paratroopers found themselves surrounded, outgunned, abandoned. Thomas had fought for 3 days without sleep, without food, watching his friends die in Dutch farmhouses and burning orchards. When the Germans finally took him, he was already more ghost than man. Hollow cheeks, eyes that had seen too much, hands that trembled from exhaustion and terror. They marched him east, 3 weeks on foot, through villages that stared at the column of prisoners like they were already dead. Thomas walked in boots that had worn through at the soles, feeling every frozen stone, every ridge of ice beneath his feet. The men around him dropped one by one, some from wounds that had never been treated, some from pneumonia. Some simply stopped walking and waited for the bullet that always came. Thomas kept moving because stopping meant dying, and somewhere deep inside him, beneath the hunger and the cold and the numbness, he still wanted to live. The camp was called Starlock IVB. It sat in a clearing surrounded by pine trees that looked black against the winter sky. Barbed wire, wooden watchtowers, barracks that leaked wind through every crack. When Thomas arrived in early November, there were already 2,000 men inside those fences. British, American, French, Russian, all of them starving. All of them counting the days until the war ended, or they did. The rations were a cruel joke. A cup of watery soup at midday, sometimes a boiled potato. Once a week, if they were lucky, a piece of bread no larger than a child's fist. The Red Cross packages that were supposed to come never did. Or if they came, they disappeared into the German supply chain, devoured by a Wehrmacht that was itself beginning to starve as the Reich crumbled from both sides. The men in Starlock IV learned to move slowly to conserve energy. They learned to sleep as much as possible. They learned not to talk about food, because talking about food made the hunger unbearable. Thomas bunked in Barracks 7 with 40 other men. They slept on wooden shelves, stacked 3 high, covered with blankets so thin you could see through them. At night, the cold came through the walls, like something alive, something that wanted to crawl inside your chest and freeze your lungs. Men coughed until they vomited. Men cried in their sleep. Men prayed in languages Thomas didn't understand, but he understood the desperation in their voices. He understood that they were all asking the same question: how much longer? By December, Thomas had lost nearly 50 pounds. His uniform hung on him like a shroud. His ribs showed through his skin like the bars of a cage. When he looked at his hands, he saw the hands of an old man, veined and skeletal, shaking with weakness. He had dysentery. Most of them did. The latrines were open pits that froze over at night, and using them was an agony of cold and sickness and shame. Some men stopped eating just to avoid the latrines. Some men stopped caring whether they lived or died. But Thomas kept a photograph in his jacket pocket, his girl Mary, smiling in a summer dress outside a pub in Surrey. He looked at it every night before he slept, even though the cold made his fingers so stiff he could barely hold it. He whispered to her in the dark, told her about the things they'd do when he got home. The house they'd buy, the gardens she'd plant, the children they'd have. He made promises to a photograph, because promises were the only thing keeping him human. The guards at Starlock IVB were not the monsters Thomas had imagined. They were not the SS, with their death's head insignias and their casual cruelty. They were Wehrmacht soldiers, mostly older men or boys too young to be sent to the front. Farmers and clerks and teachers in ill-fitting uniforms assigned to guard prisoners because they were unfit for combat. Some were missing fingers from the Eastern Front, some limped from old wounds. Some had that same haunted look in their eyes that Thomas saw in the mirror of frozen puddles. One guard in particular caught Thomas's attention. His name, Thomas would later learn, was Klaus Richter, 41 years old, a postal worker from a small town near Dresden. He had been drafted in 1943, trained for 6 weeks, and sent to the camp because of a leg injury that never healed properly. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left side. He carried a rifle that looked too heavy for his thin frame, and he had a face that Thomas could only describe as sad. Not cruel, not indifferent, just infinitely, unbearably sad. Klaus worked the night watch on the southern perimeter of the camp. He would walk his route slowly, stopping every few minutes to rest his bad leg against a fence post. Sometimes Thomas, unable to sleep from the hunger and the cold, would watch him through the gaps in the barracks wall. Watch him stamp his feet to keep warm. Watch him pull his coat tighter. Watch him stare out at the forest like he was looking for something he'd lost and would never find again. The other prisoner said Klaus was one of the decent ones. He didn't shout. He didn't beat anyone. Once, when a prisoner collapsed during roll call, Klaus had helped him to his feet instead of leaving him to die in the snow. The SS liaison who visited the camp had reprimanded him for it. He called him soft, threatened to send him to the Eastern Front, where softness would get him killed. Klaus had just nodded and said nothing and continued being decent in small, dangerous ways. It was the 3rd week of December when Thomas found the bread. He'd been assigned to a work detail outside the camp, clearing snow from the access road. The work was brutal. Men with no strength left in their bodies, swinging shovels like they weighed 100 pounds, falling, getting up, falling again. The guards stood watch, occasionally barking orders, but mostly just watching with that same exhausted indifference that had settled over everyone by late 1944. During a brief rest, Thomas noticed something near the base of a guard post. A piece of bread, wrapped in brown paper, partially buried in snow. It must have fallen from someone's pack, or been dropped, or left behind. It was roughly the size of his palm, dark rye bread, the kind the guards ate. To Thomas, it looked like a miracle. His hands shook as he picked it up. His mouth flooded with saliva. His entire body screamed at him to eat it, devour it, cram it into his mouth before anyone saw. But something made him stop. Some last fragment of the man he used to be. He looked around at the other prisoners on the work detail, saw their skeletal faces, saw their trembling hands, saw men who were even closer to death than he was. And he thought about Mary, thought about the man she had fallen in love with, the man who shared his last cigarette, the man who gave his coat to a shivering child in London during the Blitz. Was that man still alive inside this starving shell, or had the war killed him already? Thomas tore the bread into pieces. 5 pieces, roughly equal. He distributed them to the men nearest him, pressing the small portions into their shaking hands. They stared at him like he was insane. One man started crying. Another tried to refuse, saying Thomas should keep it, but Thomas shook his head. He kept one piece for himself, the smallest piece. And for 30 seconds, standing in the snow on that frozen German road, 5 starving men ate bread and felt almost human again. Klaus Richter saw everything. He was standing 20 meters away, watching the work detail, and he saw Thomas find the bread, saw him divide it, saw him give it away when any sane man would have hidden it and eaten it alone. Klaus had spent a year watching prisoners fight over scraps, steal from each other, betray each other for an extra spoonful of soup. He had watched the war reduce men to animals, and now he was watching something he had thought was no longer possible. He was watching kindness. That night, Klaus could not sleep. He lay in his bunk in the guards' quarters, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the British prisoner who had given away bread. It made no sense. In a place where every calorie was the difference between living and dying, where hunger was a physical presence that gnawed at your insides like a disease that man had chosen to share. Klaus thought about his own children, 2 daughters back in Dresden. He wondered if they were hungry too. He wondered if the war would take them before it ended. He wondered what kind of world they would inherit if every decent impulse was starved out of humanity. The next morning, during roll call, Klaus looked for Thomas, found him in the ranks, swaying slightly, eyes glazed with exhaustion. Their eyes met for a moment. Thomas saw something in Klaus's face he hadn't seen in a German guard before. Recognition, not of a name or a face, but of something deeper. The recognition of one human being seeing humanity in another. Then Klaus looked away, and the moment passed, and the prisoners were dismissed to another day of cold and hunger and waiting. 3 days before Christmas, the camp received a small shipment of Red Cross packages. Not enough for everyone, not even close. The commandant decided to distribute them by lottery. Numbers were drawn. Most men got nothing. Thomas's number was not called. He stood in the freezing yard and watched other prisoners receive their packages with trembling hands. Watched them clutch the boxes like they contained everything that mattered in the world. And he felt the hunger sharpen into something almost unbearable. That night, Thomas lay on his bunk, unable to sleep. The man above him was eating crackers from his Red Cross package, and the sound of chewing was torture. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to think of anything else. Trying to remember summer, trying to remember Mary's laugh, trying to remember what it felt like to be full. He failed at all of it. There was only the cold and the hunger and the darkness. Around midnight he heard a soft tapping on the barracks wall. A pattern. 3 taps, pause, 2 taps. The signal prisoners used when a guard was approaching. Thomas tensed, waiting for the door to slam open, for shouting, for the random violence that sometimes came in the night when guards were drunk or bored or angry at their own dying country. But the door didn't open. The tapping came again. Then silence. Thomas slipped down from his bunk. His bare feet touched the frozen floor, and he bit back a gasp. He moved to the door, pressed his ear against the wood, heard nothing. Slowly, carefully, he eased the door open a crack. The yard was empty, except for falling snow. And, on the step, placed carefully so it wouldn't blow away, was a small bundle, wrapped in cloth. Thomas grabbed it and pulled it inside, heart hammering. He unwrapped the cloth with shaking fingers. Inside was bread. Half a loaf of dark rye bread, still slightly warm, and with it a small piece of paper with 2 words written in careful English, "Thank you." Thomas stood in the dark holding that bread like it was a holy thing. He knew immediately who had left it. Knew that Klaus had risked punishment, maybe worse, to bring it. Guards who helped prisoners were shot for treason. Guards who showed mercy were sent to penal battalions on the Eastern Front, where life expectancy was measured in days. And yet Klaus had done it anyway. Had seen Thomas give away bread, and had given bread in return, not as payment, not as transaction, but as a statement. A declaration that there was still something worth preserving in this frozen hell. That humanity was not yet dead. Thomas divided the bread among the men in his barracks, kept only a small piece for himself. They ate in silence, tears running down faces too thin to be believed. Some men thanked God, some men thanked Thomas. Thomas said nothing. He just sat on his bunk, holding that small piece of paper, reading those 2 words over and over until the letters blurred. The next morning at roll call, Thomas looked for Klaus, found him standing at his usual post, rifle slung over his shoulder, face carefully blank. Their eyes met. Thomas gave the smallest nod. Klaus's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw his throat work as he swallowed, saw the faintest tremor in his hands. Then Klaus looked away, and the moment ended, and they were just prisoner and guard again, playing their roles in a war that was devouring them both. Winter deepened. The war news that filtered into the camp spoke of Germany's collapse. The Allies were pushing from the west. The Soviets were crushing the Eastern Front. The Reich was bleeding from 1,000 wounds. But in Starlock, IVB, these distant victories meant nothing. Men continued to starve. Men continued to die. The cold killed more than hunger. Pneumonia swept through the barracks like a scythe. Every morning, new bodies were carried out and buried in the frozen ground beyond the fence. Thomas survived on memories and stubborn will. The bread Klaus had left sustained him for 3 days, rationed carefully. After it was gone, the hunger returned, sharper than before, but something else remained. Something Klaus's gesture had awakened, the belief that he was still human, that the man Mary had loved was still alive somewhere inside this skeleton walking through the snow. He never spoke to Klaus directly. It was too dangerous. The SS made random inspections. Collaborators informed on guards who were too soft. But Thomas watched for him during roll calls and work details. And sometimes, when Klaus walked his night rounds, Thomas would be awake in the dark barracks, listening to the crunch of boots in snow, knowing that out there in the cold was someone who had chosen kindness when kindness was a death sentence. In mid-January, rumors began spreading through the camp. The Soviets were coming. The Red Army was less than 100 kilometers away. The commandant was preparing to evacuate the camp, march the prisoners west ahead of the Soviet advance. The men didn't know whether to be terrified or hopeful. On one hand, liberation was coming. On the other hand, a death march through winter with no food and no shelter would kill most of them before they reached wherever the Germans were taking them. On January 28th, the order came. The camp was to be evacuated in 3 days. All prisoners capable of walking would march west to another camp deeper in Germany. Those too sick to walk would be left behind with a skeleton crew of guards to await the Soviets. It was a death sentence either way. Walk and die on the road. Stay and possibly be executed before the Soviets arrived. Thomas had to choose. He was weak but not the weakest. He could probably survive the march if the weather held, and if they were fed something, anything. But many of the men in his barracks couldn't walk a kilometer. Leaving them meant abandoning them to whatever came next. Staying meant gambling on Soviet mercy, and no one knew what that mercy would look like. The night before the evacuation, Thomas sat on his bunk thinking about Mary's photograph, worn soft from handling. He thought about the bread Klaus had left. He thought about the choice to share or to hoard. And he realized that every moment of this war had been about that choice. To remain human or to become something else. To preserve the person you were, or to let the war turn you into a creature driven only by survival. He decided to stay. Let the younger men, the stronger ones, take their chances on the march. He would remain with the sick and the dying and trust that the Soviets would show more mercy than the SS. It was a foolish decision, probably. A decision based on exhaustion and a kind of spiritual surrender. But it was his decision, made freely, and that mattered. The next morning, as the evacuation began, Thomas watched from the barracks window as thousands of prisoners assembled in the yard. They looked like a parade of ghosts, shuffling through the snow in tattered uniforms. Guards shouted orders, dogs barked. The column formed and began moving through the gates, heading west, toward an uncertain fate. Thomas wondered how many would survive, wondered if he would ever know. He also watched for Klaus, scanned the guards, looking for that limping figure, that sad face. But Klaus was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he had been assigned to the march, perhaps he was already gone. Thomas felt an unexpected grief at the thought. Klaus had saved his life with that bread, with that gesture of kindness, and now they would never speak, never acknowledge what had passed between them, never say the things that needed to be said. As the last of the prisoners marched through the gate, Thomas turned away from the window. The barracks felt emptier than ever. Only 30 men remained, most of them barely conscious, fevered, dying. The guards who stayed behind were the oldest and the most broken. Men who could no longer march. Men who had been left behind just like the prisoners. Outside, the sounds of the evacuation faded. Silence settled over the camp like snow. The Soviets arrived on February 2nd. Thomas heard the tanks before he saw them, a deep rumbling that shook the earth. Then shouting in Russian, then gunfire, brief and sporadic. The remaining German guards surrendered without a fight. The camp was liberated. Soviet soldiers entered the barracks and stood frozen in the doorway, staring at what remained of the prisoners. These were hardened men who had fought their way across half of Europe, who had seen the worst the war could offer. But even they seemed shaken by what they found in Starlog, IVB, living skeletons, men who weighed less than 90 pounds, men who could barely speak, men who had been waiting to die. The Soviets brought food, but the prisoners were too weak to eat much. Their stomachs had shrunk. Rich food would kill them. So they were given broth, bread in tiny amounts, careful rations to coax their bodies back to life. Medical teams arrived. The worst cases were evacuated to field hospitals. Thomas, barely conscious with fever, was loaded onto a truck and driven west, passing through landscapes of devastation, burned villages, frozen corpses, tank wrecks half buried in snow, the ruins of the Reich. He woke in a British field hospital 2 weeks later. He had survived. Against every probability, he had survived. The doctors told him he was lucky. Told him another week and he would have been too far gone. He just nodded and said nothing. Lucky felt like the wrong word. He felt hollowed out, like something essential had been carved out of him in that camp and would never grow back. They sent him home in March. He stood on a train platform in London, wearing a uniform that had been tailored to fit his new skeletal frame, and waited for Mary. When she appeared through the crowd, he barely recognized her. She was thinner too. The war had been hungry for everyone. She ran to him, and they held each other, and she was crying, and he wanted to cry, but couldn't. Something in him was broken. The tears wouldn't come. Thomas tried to rebuild his life. He married Mary. They bought a small house in Surrey. He found work in a factory. They had 2 children. On the surface, everything was fine. But Thomas knew he was performing normalcy, pretending to be the man he used to be. Inside, he was still in that camp, still cold, still hungry, still waiting for something he couldn't name. He never spoke about Strelok IVB, never told Mary about the bread or the guard, or the choice he made to share when sharing was insane. The words wouldn't come. The experience was too big, too strange, too sacred to put into normal language. So he carried it silently, like a stone in his chest. And the years passed. The 50s became the 60s. His children grew. The world moved on from the war. But Thomas remained trapped in that winter. In that moment, when a German guard had left bread on his doorstep and changed everything. Then, in 1973, he received a letter. It came from Germany, forwarded through the Red Cross Prisoner of War Registry. The return address was a town near Dresden. Thomas stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. His hands shook. Mary asked if he was all right. He said yes, and went into his study, and closed the door, and opened the letter with a knife that made a sound like a gasp. The letter was in English, carefully written, the handwriting shaky, but precise. It began, "Dear Thomas Archer, you will not remember me. I was a guard at Strelok IVB. My name is Klaus Richter. I have been searching for you for many years." Thomas sat down hard in his chair, read the letter 3 times. Klaus had survived the war, barely. He had been captured by the Soviets during the evacuation of Dresden, spent 5 years in a labor camp in Siberia, lost his wife to the firebombing, lost his home, lost everything except his daughters, who had been evacuated before the city burned. He had returned to Germany in 1950, to a country divided and destroyed, and had spent the next 2 decades rebuilding a life from ruins. But he had never forgotten Thomas. Never forgotten the British prisoner who divided bread among starving men. Klaus wrote that the memory had sustained him through the worst of the Soviet camps, had reminded him that humanity could survive even the deepest darkness, had given him a reason to believe that what he had done, leaving that bread, had mattered, that small acts of kindness were not meaningless, that they echoed forward in ways we could never predict. Thomas wrote back immediately. The correspondence continued for years. They exchanged letters every few months, careful, thoughtful letters that danced around the enormity of what they had survived. Klaus wrote about his daughters, both married now, both with children of their own. Wrote about his work as a postal clerk, the same job he had held before the war. Wrote about the guilt he carried for what Germany had done. Wrote about his dreams, which were still filled with barbed wire and snow. Thomas wrote about his children, about his job, about the nightmares that still came some nights, about the way he could never throw away food, even spoiled food, because wasting bread felt like a sin. They wrote about small things and avoided the big things. The horror was too large to fit in letters. But the understanding between them was complete. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable, had shared a moment of impossible grace in the midst of hell. That bond was stronger than nationality, stronger than the enmity of war. In 1978, they finally met in person. Thomas and Mary traveled to Germany. Klaus met them at the train station in a small town in the Bavarian countryside, where he had retired. He was 75 years old, white-haired, stooped, walking with a cane. Thomas was 67, grey and worn. They stood on the platform looking at each other. Two old men who had once been young and terrified. Two men who had survived. Klaus spoke first. His English was better now, but still accented. He said, "I never forgot you." Thomas's voice breaking said, "I know." They embraced. Mary stood watching with tears streaming down her face. Strangers on the platform stared at the strange sight of a British couple embracing an old German man. They had no idea they were witnessing a reunion 3 decades in the making, a moment that had begun with bread in the snow. They spent 3 days together, walked through forests, sat in cafes, talked about everything except the war, until finally, on the last evening, they could avoid it no longer. Klaus said, "I have to know. Why did you share the bread? You were starving. You could have eaten it yourself." Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I had to believe I was still human. If I stopped caring about other people, even for a moment, I would have become someone my girl couldn't love, someone I couldn't live with. So, I shared it. Not because I was good, because I was terrified of who I'd become if I didn't." Klaus nodded slowly. Tears ran down his weathered face. He said, "And that's why I left you the bread. 'Cause you showed me humans still existed. I'd started to think we were all monsters, that the war had turned us into creatures without souls. But you proved me wrong, and I had to respond, and to show you that the monster in the uniform was also still human." They sat in silence after that. Mary held Thomas's hand. The light faded outside the window. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. The sound carried across the valley, soft and clear. And for a moment, in that quiet room, 2 old men who had once been enemies sat together and felt something like peace. Thomas died in 1984. At his funeral, Mary read a letter that had arrived from Germany 2 days earlier. Klaus had written one final message, knowing somehow that time was short. The letter said, "You saved my life in that camp, not my body, but my soul. You reminded me that kindness was still possible, that we could choose to be human, even when the world demanded we be beasts." I carried that knowledge through every dark day that followed. It lit my path, it gave me strength, and now at the end, I want you to know that bread I left on your doorstep was the most important thing I ever did. Everything good in my life came from that moment. Everything. The mourners wept. Mary folded the letter carefully and placed it in Thomas's coffin over his heart. Klaus died 6 months later, surrounded by his daughters and grandchildren. In his possessions they found a worn photograph of Thomas from his prisoner file. On the back, in faded ink, were 2 words, "Thank you." This is what survives of war, not the battles, not the strategies, not the grand movements of armies and the decisions of generals, but the small moments, the shared bread, the kindness between enemies, the recognition that we are all human, all vulnerable, all capable of choosing mercy, even when mercy is dangerous. Thomas and Klaus understood this. In a world trying to convince them they were mortal enemies, they insisted on seeing each other as men, as fathers, as people who deserved dignity, even in the midst of horror. Their story is not unique. There are thousands of such stories buried in the archives of war. Moments of grace that bloomed in frozen camps and burning cities. Gestures of kindness between people who were supposed to hate each other. These moments don't erase the horror. Nothing erases the horror. But they remind us that the horror is not inevitable. That humans, even in the darkest circumstances, can choose something better. The bread Thomas shared was small enough to fit in his hand. The bread Klaus left was half a loaf, gone in 3 days. But the meaning of that bread echoed across decades, sustained 2 men through darkness, gave them a story to cling to when the nightmares came, proved that in the frozen winter of 1944, in a camp designed to strip away humanity, 2 men had looked at each other and chosen to remain human. And that choice, small and private and witnessed by no one, changed everything. This is the story we must remember, not because it makes war tolerable, but because it makes us remember what we are, what we can be, even in the depths, even in the cold, even when everything tells us to abandon mercy and preserve only ourselves. We can share bread, we can leave bread, we can choose, always, to remain human. Thomas and Klaus proved it. And their proof echoes still, a whisper across the years. Thank you, thank you.